Welcome to the Better Together podcast, where we look for ways we can work together to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. Today, I have with us Robert Posner, and many of you know him if you're a Free Will Baptist. You're aware of his former ministry as a pastor and his former work in Free Will Baptist denominational work. Today, he's going to talk to us about what can be a difficult subject. He's going to share his story with us, but I think if you'll listen to this podcast, you're going to learn. Maybe you're struggling with some of the same things that he had struggled with in the past, that the Lord gives us hope and the Lord helps us in some of the most difficult things and some of the most shameful things that we can experience. And so, Robert, first of all, praise the Lord for what he's done for you and your life. And let's just start out by getting you to tell us a bit about your story. And I think that's going to be helpful for our listeners to realize there's help maybe for them personally, or if not for them personally, for someone that they may know. So thank you for taking the time to be with us and talk about this difficult topic today.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. To be honest, over the past few years, I've really wondered where I'd ever fit back into ministry and things of that nature. And let me just share why. Um, to give a little foundational and to keep it brief at the same time. Um, for the first 15 years of my life, I grew up in a home that wasn't a follower of Christ. My parents struggled in their relationship and eventually divorced. But one of the things that seeds were planted in my life um, was my father was a person who objectified women. He was continually seeing them as an object for his own purposes and his own pleasures. That spilled over into pornography as it was at the time, which was more, you know, paperback kind of stuff or magazine things, which as a kid I found and wasn't sure what I was making sense of, but it still created an interest in my head. Um, as I grew up, that continued, and then of course I had my early teen years, and that created its own set of curiosities and ideas. But then at 15, when I became a follower of Christ, that there was instantly a conflict within me that constantly battled at that. And it worked through many years, thankfully, through the discipleship of a great church. And I was able to really live much more victorious over what I thought was going to be just the consuming thing of my life. Um, and it pretty much stayed at bay. I would say that it did for many years. Eventually, I felt called to ministry, went into ministry, and served as a pastor in two locations. The last one for over 20 years, and largely found it at bay. I found in looking back at the long history of things that it would come back. It seemed to come back at moments either of high stress or of extreme frustration with what was happening, and I felt like I'd lost control or things were out of control.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it became almost like a numbing medicine at that moment. And then once I kind of seemed to get the conviction as well as just the strength of God's Spirit and the truth of His Word would just help me kind of begin to push that back. But it was always pushed back in the back. It was never dealt with. It was never processed. It was never thought through. And at the moment, I didn't make those connections. So I just thought, well, the enemy's really bugging me at this moment for some reason. I didn't make the connection that some of it had to do with what I was dealing with, the stress or the frustration of not being able to accomplish what I thought I could, or what I thought God wanted me to. Um, and then we had a situation where we had always had people move in and out of our home, but I had a situation where we had a young lady in our home, and for she was in our home for 2+ years, and for about 2 of those years, everything was healthy and normal. On the surface, what was lying underneath that was the fact that I had let some boundaries down that I should have kept up and would have helped me manage any temptations that would have come along. But I let those boundaries down, and by letting those boundaries down, conversations were being had, information that normally would never have happened between me and a woman were happening, and temptations then begin to come, and then you add the seeds that were planted from the past, and all that came together. Now, I'm not saying it all forced me to do something I didn't want to do. It certainly didn't do that. It forced me to do something that my flesh wanted to do, without a doubt. And in doing so, I broke my covenant with my wife, and those seeds and foundational things moved me to act in a way towards this young lady that was very unchristlike, and I broke that covenant with my wife. I broke that covenant with my church family that I believe I had, and the covenant with God in a lot of ways. And I went through the next several years battling depression and anxiety because I lost my ministry over that, over my actions and my behavior, and rightly so. Um, and having lost my ministry, I struggled with two areas. One was, what I'd done to lose it, but then so much of my identity was wrapped up in it that now all of a sudden in 24 hours it was gone.
Yeah.
And so the transition wasn't healthy at all. Thankfully, I had some friends that reached out and kind of just kept encouraging me and supporting me, which I can, I would say that's one of the things that I would really encourage. If somebody's struggling with something and it comes out, the best thing you can do, even if you don't know what to say, is to contact them. Man, it was so lonely at times, but eventually, uh, through counseling, through a combination of support group that dealt specifically with the issue of sexual brokenness, and which is really where I was struggling with how to manage that sexuality. In my church, in all of my church experience, it was rarely ever talked about, and so I wouldn't talk about it. And so I really believe that had I had the opportunity to kind of process and think through and talk about and get a biblical understanding of sexuality earlier on, I could have managed and handled those temptations in a much bigger way, a better way. Certainly, I'm not blaming. I'm just identifying areas that could have been improved for me. And because at the end of the day, I want to make it clear, I made choices, and those choices were wrong and sinful, and they hurt people. And but at the same time, um, as I look forward, I think, okay, uh, is there some areas, and that's where I am now, is trying to look forward. I've identified where it got me to where I am today, out of pastoral ministry. Thankfully, I've gone through restoration through the Free Will Baptist in Texas. They've had me on a restoration process for 6 years. My marriage is restored. We celebrated our 40th anniversary this year. My wife and I both celebrated our 60th birthday, so we just had a great time this year. Um, and I've restored my relationship with many of my friends in the past. And with the state of Texas Free Will Baptist, I've even stood up before them and apologized publicly, and they have received me graciously, as well as the church that I was ministering at the time. They've received me graciously as well. And so I thank God for taking me through a very dark time. Um,
Mhm.
I'll say this, and Free Will Baptists will probably get this. I've never been drunk. I never drunk in my life, but for the first time in my life, for a brief time there, I thought, man, if it'll help me escape what I'm feeling right now, I want to go that way. Thankfully, I did not. But boy,
It
it was
was
the first time I thought, well, if anything would get me out of this.
it was that bad.
Yeah, it was. I know I'm laughing, but it was just at the moment, man, it was the end of the world. It was the first time I'd ever questioned and thought about suicide. It's the first time I'd ever just thought about wondering what it'd be like to just escape and get away. It took me into such a dark place. But thankfully, between the friends who reached out, as well as just the groups that I found that said, "Hey, we can walk with you through this," people who had been through it, who'd come back to say, I know where you are, let me walk with you forward. And that was a huge, huge help. They were honest, they were transparent, they were
Yeah.
vulnerable, they were what I needed, and I thank God for them.
So let's stop and kind of think that through for a bit. So
Sure.
it was under the surface really for many years, and when you were under stress, it would be more likely, and you're saying, I really didn't see the connection there, but then there was this major event. But if my memory is correct, you immediately repented of it. You were some might say you owned it. And during that period, there's people that are reaching out to you and not forgotten you, which you're also saying, let's always remember that when somebody falls, you don't know what to say. Don't worry so much. Just reach out and say, look, I'm praying for you, or I'm here for you. And that ended up leading you to really some really good help, that helped you with sexual wholeness and the rest of it.
Yes.
And so what could have been, I mean, if we think about it, hey, you're like, hey, for the first time I'm ever thinking about maybe taking my life, or drinking, or all the rest of it, you went from that to where you're at now, where you've celebrated the anniversary with your wife, you're still married, and all the rest of it.
Mhm.
So it's brought you all the way along, and now you're trying to kind of play offense a little bit, aren't you?
I am. I am. I am trying to. I think back of, like I said, over the period of my life, and I think what could have made the difference in that. And some of it was just, I think as I thought through it, the biggest thing was just having someone that could speak into that area, that could say, let me tell you about some of the dangers that are sitting in our culture that can have an underlying effect on you. And so many of, and I'll say from a pastoral perspective, so many of us are in a situation where if we are tempted, people see it differently in the congregation. I wish they didn't, but it's the world in which we live. And a member of your congregation can have the same temptation, and people will care for them and talk to them and help them through that and be somewhat compassionate about it. Whereas when a pastor finds himself in that role, the answer seems to be, well, we just need to get rid of him and put a new one in.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the fear, that when I realized, whoa, I am way in over my head. This is a big deal. I don't know what to do. I'm scared to death. Um, but if I tell someone, my whole world will fall apart.
Yeah, you were trapped,
Yeah,
really,
I felt
and
trapped. And
making
it
far more
wasn't that
vulnerable.
my church didn't, I honestly believe, thinking back on it, if I'd had a clearer head, I think there was probably some in my church that would have done the very things that needed to be done. But um, there was never that general conversation that would have made that door more easier to walk through. And then there were people outside of the church that I even would call my accountability people, that had we been a little more honest and open, I think it would have made it easier to walk through that door. It's not an easy door to walk through. It's very scary to talk about things that are of such a personal nature, um, especially if it crosses some very immoral and some very uncomfortable lines, such as, I have a friend who's a good, godly man, pastors a good church, but he confesses that he struggles with attractions that aren't healthy and
Yeah,
that are very unbiblical. But yet he's fighting that on a daily basis, and he's fighting that in his own life, and he's working through that, and thankfully he's finding victory. And but for him to just admit that to anyone could be very dangerous to his
yeah,
whole life in a
could
lot
be
of
offending.
ways. And depending on who he admitted it to, it could either escalate or create other problems, isolation and so on. So yeah, so as I look back on that, I thought, well, that's what I need to do, is figure out, is there a way from my experience that I can speak into other men's lives? And so I've been blessed with the opportunity from several groups to share at different men's retreats. about my story, and I try to be a little more direct and personal, certainly talking to men, try to get their attention in that process with the directness of it. And at the same time, give them some hope of saying, look, there is a way. If you're struggling with porn, if you're struggling with an attraction for a woman in your church, you're struggling with some other kind of sexual brokenness in your life, if you will reach out to good, in this way, you can find hope and victory over that and find a new cleanness in the sense of your own thought life and purity again in your thought life, and find victory over the temptations that right now in our world seem to bombard us every day, whether it's billboards or or internet searches or whatever. Yeah, it's everywhere. uh,
Everywhere. So
yeah.
if you're talking like to yourself 10 years ago, you would really be saying, get some help.
Get some help.
And you are admitting, I didn't know where to go to get help.
Right.
So let's kind of walk somebody through that's listening to this right now, or maybe even folks within a church that want to provide support. Like, you're thinking now, your church probably would have been supportive than you thought, like if you went back 10 years ago.
Sure.
So let's kind of walk through that a little bit. What can they do? What can a person do?
um well, we eventually started about 3 years ago. We started a nonprofit called 2416. It's based on Proverbs 24:16, which teaches us that though a righteous man falls 7 times, he will get back up. But a fool falls once, and I like one particular translation says, and he is ruined. And it's pretty much that's the description or the hope for us in Christ. In Christ, that's the righteous. They have the ability to, yes, stumble, and God sees that, but He helps them get back up. He helps them find victory, to learn from that, to grow from that. Um, where someone who just refuses the help of God, who refuses the help of others, it's just going to ruin that sin, is going to continually ruin their life. So, in the ministry side, we thought, well, we'll be that help, we'll be that support that says, if you come to us and say, I'm struggling, then we can say without judgment, hey, we know where you are. I know where you have been, and we want to offer you help and give you some practical as well as solid biblical ideas and directions of how to find victory over the temptations, build boundaries in your life that can help you work through the struggles that are the temptations that may be coming either from your church or outside of your church or on the internet or wherever. Um, and where needed, we'll direct them, because I don't serve officially in any counseling capacity. I'm just a mentor, one who's been there and says, I've been there, done that, let me tell you how not to do that. um, I would direct them to our counseling group within our denomination, and any other areas that would be helpful, because I've found benefit from using both in my own life, a ministry like ours as well as the counseling. So our ministry offers to churches, if you will, we're nonprofit, so if you will provide subsidy or a monthly or a yearly kind of gift, it helps subsidize. Right now I started just last night with a pastor who'd lost his ministry, sad to say. He came out to me after it already happened, and he didn't have a job.
Yeah.
And so, I said, well, for now, let's just work on getting you where you need to be. I will pray and ask God's people to help provide for that. And so the churches that give to that help provide for places like that. It's not uncommon for guys to lose their income when initially found out. The other side of that is, I can say to a pastor who hasn't lost his ministry, or to anyone who hasn't lost their job, maybe their wife's threatening to leave them or something, I can say to them, listen, let's take the pressure of the money off the table for a moment, and let's just focus on getting you well. When you can, if you can help, cover expenses, we'd appreciate it. And thankfully, we have churches that are helping to support in that. I always ask them to try to have some skin in the game, to put something in, but the ministry comes alongside the church. We can provide insights to the men of the church. My wife does ministry to the wives which has been a great thing. She just shared with the Texas women our story, as well as what they can do to help other women who find themselves struggling in this situation, whether they're struggling with their own sexual brokenness or whether they're struggling with betrayal, which is a big, big issue. My wife specifically focuses on the betrayal side and the trauma that comes from that. But she is able to walk alongside those ladies that feel broken and their husbands have violated their trust, and able to walk them through and help them to see and find healing, as well as find a healthy place to be ready if their husband chooses to find that. In some cases, sad to say, they don't, but the wives can then at least figure out a healthy direction forward without being dependent upon their husband's healing. But if their husband does find healing, which we've experienced, it's a wonderful thing. We just spent time with a couple over a few days that they were in ministry. He lost his ministry. They went through the program with both Judy and I, and we're able to now, he said, we're back heavily involved in church, very excited about what God's doing and me getting involved in ministry again. And they've been able to have almost 2 years of good, solid restoration and recovery in their marriage and in their lives. And so partnering a church, you can go to the website. It's the same thing, 2416ministries.org. On the website, gives you a general description. You'll find I'm very transparent on there. My phone number's on there. You'll find it. But there's also a link that's on there if you say, hey, I want to talk and about anything related to the ministry, or I'll open it up. You just need to talk, and you're a pastor. I'll talk to you. But you click that link and it schedules. Excuse me. You can schedule a time. With that, it'll looks at my schedule. I don't know how it works. You know how computers are these days. It looks at our schedule and says he's free for this time. Can you make that? And then it schedules it for you.
So what could have been a disaster and probably felt like it was disaster a few years ago is actually turned into a positive, where God's taken you and using you to help pastors, their wives, to get through this brokenness and really live whole lives, is what I hear you saying, Robert.
Yes. Well, thank you for summarizing the ramble there for a little bit.
No,
but
it does seem to me like, a lot of the people that you have worked with, especially in the last couple of years, when somebody's gone through it, it is one of these areas where it is pretty helpful, isn't it?
It does. It helps to have someone that can look you in the eye and say, I may not have all the answers, but I know how you feel right now.
Yeah.
I know the hopelessness, the fear, the what ifs that you're going through. I went through those, and there'll be some uniquenesses for every person, but we'll have enough in common that it'll help. It helps. And that's all you need many times. Just somebody who says, what do I do? And, that was the other thing. I kept asking myself, what do I do now? Where do I even start life now? And to have somebody that could say, okay, I've been there. Let me walk with you through that.
So it does help to see here's somebody that went through it and they've come out on the other side, and God's taking them and using them. And I think a lot of our listeners would probably know about Mark Laser, who passed away fairly recently, but he probably touched far more lives after his fall, if you will, than before. So it shows that life goes on and God continues to he even uses broken people pretty well, doesn't he?
He does. He does. Well, there's a Bible full of them.
There is. That genealogy of Jesus too, isn't
it? Yeah, exactly right. Very true.
Well,
yeah, Robert, I can say from Mark Laser, his book and helped both my wife and I both work through things. So great stuff.
Just good stuff. So what you're saying is there is hope and there is help.
Yes.
And so you're listening today. You can reach out to Robert, and we encourage you to support his ministry, because it's just a wonderful opportunity, and it's the kind of thing the church really needs to talk about. And so give them that website one more time, Robert, where they could reach out to you.
Okay, it's 2416ministries.org.
.org. So
And I would add, if you also, if you want to, if you'd be interested in myself or, my wife or one of us coming and sharing in some way with the men or the women, or right now I'm also filling in for guys that need some filling. So
you're
I'm
in
doing some of
Texas,
that too.
but
So,
you would do your best if folks would
to
think about
help.
that, and it's a way to kind of open up the conversation and to not just open it up, but also to provide some resources and some help for some people that would be struggling with this. So, Robert, I greatly appreciate that. Appreciate what you're doing. I want to point out to our listeners, we do have the counseling program, and
Mhm.
now we're up to 9 different professionals that work in different ways. And so it's completely confidential for pastors and or their wives. And so if you're interested in that, just email us at questions@nafwb.org, and we'll ask you a few questions back. Usually we can set folks up pretty quickly. And then we do encourage people, as you're listening, think about how you could utilize Robert, and you could probably use him in your church to kind of help people think about this in such a broken society. Really, it's a skill set. You can bring hope because you've experienced it firsthand. So thank you for that, Robert. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I do, want to say to all of you about Dr. Moody, one of the first people I called was him to say, hey, I have made a huge mistake and sinned and done this and explained things to him. And he was very gracious. Now, not everybody may get that opportunity if you find yourself in that spot, but I can say his heart is for our people and for the Free Will Baptists, and I thank God for that.
Well, and I think that's also kind of important to remember, going back to that, you reminded me a little bit of the prodigal son. He's
Mm,
not demanding anything. You were truly broken and truly repentant. And I think as you look at that, that's been the key. I think that's
I
why
agree.
God is
Mm.
has used you, and I believe will continue to use you. And so I just appreciate you doing that, Robert. And still praying, buddy. And I think even better things are in store.
Well, I believe so too. With Christ, they always are. So thank the
That's
Lord.
right.
So, yes, well, thank you for this privilege and this opportunity. And if there's any way I can help my Free Will Baptist, I mean, I was saved, discipled, and ministered in Free Will Baptist, and I love the people, and that's all I want to do is try to help. So,
Excellent.
that's what I'm doing.
Well, thank you for joining us. And we want to thank you, our listeners. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And we encourage you to support Robert's ministry. We encourage you to support the counseling ministry through the National Association of Free Will Baptists. And whatever you can do, every little bit truly does make a difference. It truly does count. Remember, when we all are working together, we accomplish so much more. We're better together. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today.